Welcome to the podcast. These episodes are designed to be a little more timeless and are part of our relaunch efforts of our flagship podcast series. We'll release these episodes weekly on our YouTube channel and across podcast streaming platforms. Each weekly segment will focus on things that are unlikely to fall out of the news cycle over time, and our coverage will go a little deeper than short news bites. The first episode in this three-part series on criminal justice focused on bail reform. Last week, we covered crimes, prison, and recidivism. Tonight's segment will look at policing and crime in America. Let's get to it. We can trace today's modern policing to America's first settlers, who brought with them the English Anglo-Saxon common law, its system of social obligation, sheriffs, constables, and watchmen. Dating to the 1630s, before formal police systems existed, U.S. colonies were protected by a night watch, considered to be the first public police forces. The first of these watchmen were organized in Boston in 1631, and in New Amsterdam, later New York, in 1647. In general, the watchmen were paid for their services by private citizens, with the exception of Boston and New York, where they were paid a fee by the city. As our society became less rural and agrarian, and more urban and industrialized, crime, riots, and other public disturbances became more common. When immigrants from Germany and Ireland began settling in cities like Boston and New York between 1820 and 1860, they clashed with the original settlers from England and the Netherlands. Americans that had settled here in previous century were mainly from England and the Netherlands, and the cultures and lifestyles of these new immigrants offended their sensibilities. The existence of large immigration populations in the crowded cities of the East was perceived as a threat to the very fabric of American society. Crime began to rise. The cities in the north saw mob, public lewdness, disorderly conduct, and prostitution. The watchmen weren't well suited for controlling the increasing crime rates. They were soon replaced by organized police forces. Policing in the north used London as its template for establishing police departments, but law enforcement evolved differently in the south. Police forces in the southern states were created specifically to preserve the system of slavery. The first form of policing in the South was known as the Slave Patrol, which began in the colonies of Carolina in 1704. Slave rebellions were a constant threat to the economic status quo of Southern plantation owners. Slave patrols ensured that the owners were able to intimidate and punish any insurgencies or revolts. Many historians believe that the Slave Patrol was the first distinctly American police system. It set the pattern of policing that Americans of African descent would experience throughout their history in America. These patrols enforced chattel slavery as they traveled on horseback with whips, ropes, guns to attempt to catch runaway slaves. In return, these wealthy plantation owners protected the interest of the slave catchers. This practice resulted in a social hierarchy between the wealthy landowners at the top, the slave patrols separating the wealthy from the poor, and the enslaved who were at the bottom of this hierarchy. The political era of policing. By 1880, most American major cities had created police agencies. Each was public and bureaucratic, had full-time policemen, and reported to a governmental authority. However, there were no personnel standards. Officers were selected based solely on their political associations. In most departments, recruits received no formal training. Routine police patrols in the political era was hopelessly inefficient. Officers patrolled on foot and were spread very thin. For example, in Chicago, police officers walked a beat that were 3 and 4 miles long. In many cities, entire areas were not patrolled at all. As a result, supervision was weak or non-existent. And at this time, police had close connections with political organizations and corruption ran rampant. Police forces were largely controlled by politicians who directed what an officer would do while on duty. The mayor of a city often handpicked police officers. Because of this, police departments tended to reflect the dominant political interest, and politics influenced the loyalty of police officers. Some political party leaders who owned bars or coordinated gangs bribed police officers to allow illegal activities to continue in the precinct, and the police amounted to nothing more than a personal gang for mayors in many cities. Reform era of policing. In the 19th century and early 20th century, the progressive movement focused on social and political reform. During this reform era, Activists worked to separate policing from politics by building a nonpartisan police force and advocated for reorganizing how the police operated. This period of time saw training and standards established, and police officers became more professionalized. Detective units were created, with trained law enforcement to investigate crimes. Members of the public knew the police corruption was rampant, with many officers accepting bribes or participating in illegal activity themselves. Then came August Vollmer, chief of police in Berkeley, who is considered to be the father of modern policing. He stressed the importance of sociology, social work, psychology, and management in police work. Vollmer's advocacy for progressive reforms were focused on changing public perception about the police to see them as professionals. His approach, which included delving deeply into the causes of crime to solve that issue, began to spread throughout the United States. Policing became more standard across jurisdictions and began to become professionalized. Yet the corruption still occurred, especially in large cities where the Italian-American mafia gained power during Prohibition. As a result, President Herbert Hoover appointed the Wickersham Commission in 1929 to investigate problems in law enforcement. Over time, policing in America became a blend of the traditions and practices of the past in our early history and these new reforms. In the decades since, changes in technology, laws, and in societal norms have improved many aspects of American policing. Despite all of these changes and advances, though, Black people in America continue to experience deferential enforcement behavior. Some police departments and individual police officers still behave in ways that reinforce economic and racial segregation and injustice. Despite the efforts by advocates and reformers to balance these inequities, the earliest policing of Black people created a through line that persists today. Community policing in the 1980s. The professional model of policing and the emphasis on crime control, instead of on maintaining order and focus on services activity, were partially blamed for significant incidences of social unrest and unexpected increases in crime rates in the mid to late 20th century. According to a 2017 report from the Manhattan Institute, during the 1980s, police began reconsidering their strategy and their efforts became identified with the transition to community policing. The new strategy urged police to reach out to various communities and institutions to gain, at a minimum, their consent to be policed. It required the recognition that even within the same city, different neighborhoods have different problems. Law enforcement adopted a new mission of policing far broader than its previous role as the front end of criminal justice system focused on arresting and processing offenders. A major contributor to this evolution was James Q. Wilson and George L. Killing's 1982 broken window thesis. Wilson and Killing argued that neighborhood disorderly behavior and conditions are sequentially linked to fear of crime, citizen abandonment of public spaces, serious crime, and urban decay. And as a result, police should take disorderly conditions and behavior seriously and deal with them directly. They advised police to focus on maintaining order in neighborhoods that hadn't quite tipped from disorder to violent crime, and emphasized that maintaining order requires more than arresting lawbreakers. Aggressively enforcing even low-level laws, as well as community standards, soon influenced policing across the United States. Law enforcement professionals embraced the broken windows metaphor and readily folded it into the doctrine of community policing. The result is a generation of American cops aggressively policing many urban neighborhoods based on the premise that cracking down on even minor street disorder would avert spikes in more serious crime. To this day, the broken windows theory is still defended by many in law enforcement, despite a breadth of research supporting its impact. In other words, research does not support that it works. Kelling has since said that the theory was often misapplied, and this is true if you read his work. He said that he envisioned the theory of broken windows only as a tactic in a broader effort in community policing, which would include things like helping with jobs, getting people the services they need, mental health, etc. In practice, though, it's become synonymous with misdemeanor arrest and summons, leading to a revolving door in local and county jails. Instead of resulting in better relations between the police and community members, the broken windows theory has largely normalized police aggression towards communities of color. Its legacy is found in nearly every urban community today. Even where departments have provided new training techniques, the theory is part of law enforcement's DNA. Predictive policing. A 2020 review by the Brenner Center for Justice discusses a policing model that's marked the 21st century. That model is predictive policing. It involves using algorithms to analyze massive amounts of information in order to predict and help prevent potential future crimes. Predictive policing tools are mainly deployed by municipal police departments, though private vendors and federal agencies play major roles in their implementation. Place-based predictive policing, the most widely practiced method, typically uses pre-existing crime data to identify places and times that have a high risk of crime. Person-based predictive policing attempts to identify individuals or groups who are likely to commit crime or be the victim of crime by analyzing for risk factors such as past arrest or victimization patterns. Using the analysis helps law enforcement mobilize their resources in places where crime tends to concentrate and to identify individuals who are, purportedly anyways, more likely to commit or be a victim of crime. Proponents argue that predictive policing can help predict crime more accurately and effectively than traditional police methods. They believe it prevents crime from happening by mobilizing police resources in places where crime tends to concentrate. That makes intuitive sense. More police officers in an area means less crime due to the fact that they are there and their presence deters crime. On the other hand, though, critics point out an inherent problem with this model. Crime forecasting by statistical data can result in skewed depictions of society and criminal behavior as they tend to remove context. The risk is that predictive policing could result in less effective and maybe even more discriminatory police interventions. Use of this model can and does exacerbate racial tension between law enforcement and African American communities. The reason for this is that crime tends to be located in poorer and disadvantaged communities. Trying to prevent crime by focusing police forces on some addresses, street corners, and blocks typically increases police-citizen encounters as well. Some of these encounters, even between police and law-abiding citizens caught up in the dragnet, turn violent. Big data companies claim that their technology can help remove bias from police decision-making, but algorithms that rely on historical data risk reproducing those same biases. There are examples that illustrate the inherent risk of this model. One of the earliest adopters was the Los Angeles Police Department, which started working with federal agencies in 2008 to explore predictive policing approaches. Since then, the LAPD rolled out a variety of predictive policing programs, including LASER, which identifies areas where gun violence is thought likely to occur, and PredPol, which calculates hotspots with a high likelihood of property-related crime. Both of these programs were funded by the Federal Bureau of Justice Assistance. But LASER was shut down in 2019 after LAPD's Inspector General released an internal audit that found significant problems with the program, including inconsistencies in how individuals were selected and kept in the system. Furthermore, some California police departments have discontinued their PredPol programs as well. The New York Police Department, the largest police force in the United States, developed its own in-house predictive policing algorithms and started to use them back in 2013. According to a 2017 paper by the department's staff, the NYPD created predictive algorithms for several crime categories, including shootings, burglaries, felony assaults, grand larceny of motor vehicles, and robberies. Those algorithms are used to help assign officers to monitor specific areas. While the NYPD has described some of the information that is fed into these algorithms, such as complaints for the 7 major crime categories, shooting incidences, and 911 calls for shots fired, it has not disclosed the datasets in response to a public records request from the Brenner Center. Moving on to Chicago, the Associated Press has reported that beginning in 2012, the Chicago Police Department ran one of the country's biggest person-based predictive policing programs, relying on a network of tech-focused facilities known as Strategic Decision Support Centers. The centers are staffed by police and data analysts who use surveillance video, gunshot detection systems, and other information to help guide patrol officers on the streets and develop strategies to prevent gun violence. First piloted in 2012, the program, called the Heat List or Strategic Subject List, created a list of people it considered most likely to commit gun violence or be the victim of it. The list relied on several factors, including age during an individual's latest arrest, the number of times someone was the victim of a shooting, battery, or assault, and their total number of arrests for unlawful weapons. A report from the Rand Institute, though, showed that the list included every single person arrested or fingerprinted in Chicago since 2013. The Chicago Sun-Times reported in 2017 that the list included people who were never charged with a violent crime or illegal gun possession. This data was used to score an individual's propensity to commit future crimes. The higher your score, the more likely you were considered to become a victim or the perpetrator of gun violence. The scores were used by the department's custom notification program, which sent police and outreach workers to meet with people deemed to be at risk of becoming a victim or perpetrator of gun violence. It was later found that the scores were also added to arrest records and used to identify people for targeted busts. In early 2020, Chicago police ended the program after a watchdog report from the Office of the Inspector General warned the department of serious flaws in this approach. One flaw, according to the Inspector General Joseph Ferguson, was that the scores effectively punished individuals for criminal acts for which they had not been convicted of. Ferguson's office also found that the department failed to train officers and commanders about the meaning of the scores and failed to update the totals between August of 2016 and January of 2019. Despite all this, predictive policing remains widely used across the country. There are concerns that these programs could threaten rights protected by the Fourth Amendment, which requires reasonable suspicion for a police officer to make a stop, a legal standard that helps protect individuals against unreasonable searches and seizures by the police. Predictive analytics tools may make it easier for police to claim that individuals meet the reasonable suspicion standard, ultimately justifying more stops. Civil rights organizations, researchers, and advocates from overly policed communities have expressed concerns that using algorithmic techniques to forecast crime could perpetuate existing racial biases in the criminal justice system. A 2019 study by the AI Now Institute described how some police departments rely on dirty data, or data that is derived from or influenced by corrupt, biased, and unlawful practices, including both discriminatory policing and manipulation of crime statistics to inform their predictive policing systems. A reliance on historical data can also replicate biased police practices and reinforce over-policing of communities of color. It can also be used to manipulate crime numbers to meet quotas or produce ambitious crime reduction results, and can give rise to more policing in the neighborhoods in which those statistics are concentrated. Some critics have even labeled predictive policing as a form of tech washing that gives racially biased policing methods the appearance of objectivity simply because a computer or algorithm seems to replace human judgment. Concurrent with the application of predictive policing model is another noticeable trend, the militarization of police. Starting in the late 90s, the Department of Defense authorized the transfer of military equipment to police departments across the country. And in the wake of 9/11, several local police departments received funding from the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense, with little to no oversight of how that money was to be spent. This has led to the unnecessary purchase of military equipment, including armored cars, bulletproof vests for dogs, advanced bomb disarming robots, and weaponry once only seen in a war zone. As a result, we've seen a booming of special weapons and tactics, or SWAT teams. 80% of cities with 25,000 to 50,000 inhabitants now have these specialized teams. Even some of the smallest police forces in the country have tactical weaponry and equipment whose power far exceeds the policing needs of their community. The issue of race. The roots of policing history in America and its evolution over time has resulted in the gestalt that we have today. The incremental changes didn't occur in a singular and successive vacuum. The empowerment of upper economic classes in our earliest days provided the basis of the us versus them issues we see in our communities now. The fear of Southern whites after the Civil War led to policing designed to maintain their position over freed black people, policing that carries inherent bias to this day. As society has changed and grown, these fundamental issues become more ingrained in the bedrock of our systems of justice. The inequities of application of policing have likewise grown, with a cumulative result. As a 2020 article for Cornell University's Evidence-Based Living reported, activists have been calling for police reform in the areas of use of force for years. However, no federal program exists that requires the collection of this data. Because of the lack of federal data, media outlets and nonprofit organizations began collecting their own data on police shootings. The Washington Post began a crowdsourced database in 2015 that categorizes police violence by age, race, weapon, and geographic location. Another project, Mapping Police Violence, compiles information from 3 other crowdsourced databases. Based on the best data available, researchers estimated that Black Americans are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be killed by police compared to white Americans. A study conducted by Princeton statistical researchers found Black people fatally shot by police were also twice as likely as white people to be unarmed. The limited data available points to a serious problem with policing in America, but they don't provide a clear picture of what's happening in US cities every day. For example, they don't quantify situations where police officers use unwarranted force, but the civilian is not seriously physically harmed or killed, or whether police officers unfairly target minority communities. In a study published this year, researchers at Princeton University demonstrated that studies often underestimate racial bias in policing or even mask discrimination entirely. In other words, the problem may be much worse than it appears in these studies. Other researchers have approached the topic from different perspectives. For example, a working paper published earlier this year by the National Bureau of Economic Research analyzed more than 2 million 911 calls made in 2 American cities. They found that white officers were 55 to 65% more likely to use force compared to Black officers when responding to similar calls. They also found that white officers increased their use of force significantly when they were sent to primarily Black neighborhoods. For their part, Black officers increased their use of force moderately in these neighborhoods, but not as much as white officers. On the whole, the authors found that interacting with an opposite race police officer resulted in a 30 to 60% increase in the use of force. When it comes to firearms, white officers were twice as likely to use gun force overall compared to Black officers. Opposite race officers dispatched to a 911 call were 5 times more likely to fire their gun in these situations as well. The authors point to multiple limitations of their study though. First, they only studied 911 calls and not every interaction between officers and civilians. In addition, in the cities included in the study, a disproportionate amount of crime occurs in minority neighborhoods, which may skew the results. However, despite these shortcomings, the data on racial bias in law enforcement and on police shootings in America, while incomplete, point to a serious problem in how law enforcement officers react to and treat racial minorities. In recent years, as cell phones and other cameras have become ubiquitous, Americans from all backgrounds have become aware of the complaints of excessive force by police, particularly against communities of color. Policing after George Floyd. In recent years, as cell phones and other cameras have become ubiquitous, Americans from all backgrounds have become aware of complaints of excessive force by police, particularly against people of color. But it screamed into our national consciousness in May of 2020, when George Floyd died in broad daylight at the hands of police, captured and live-streamed from bystander cell phones. Floyd's killing caused worldwide protest, with millions of people of all races and nationalities taking to the streets in a united front, demanding equity in policing for people of color. George Floyd's death occurred during a once-in-a-century pandemic, which ultimately meant the world was watching. Marches and demonstrations for racial justice began the night of Floyd's murder in countries across the globe. The protests went on for weeks, and in some areas of the country, these persisted for months. The media sparked an interest not only in Floyd's death, but the deaths of people of color at the hands of police generally. Pledges were made by police departments, by activists, and by members of legislature to reform policing to balance these inequities. The police officers responsible for George Floyd's death were also arrested and charged with murder. That act alone was emblematic of the feeling that we were entering a time of sociological importance. It inevitably led to a massive focus on use of force by law enforcement and the training that police officers are given. What we learned was that officer training had for years been left to the devices of a retired Army Ranger and former West Point instructor named Dave Grossman. Grossman's approach to police training flew under the radar of the general public for more than 2 decades. Hundreds of police agencies have been trained via his methods. The training takes the form of intensive seminars and online instruction. The course is called On Combat, and it is steeped in a pseudo-academic field called killology. He defines killology as the scholarly study of the destructive act, just as sexology is the scholarly study of the procreative act. Dave Grossman is one of America's best-known independent police trainers, and one of the foremost proponents of the warrior cop mindset. Under the aegis of Killology Research Group, he travels the country offering continuing education seminars to cops. Justin Peters, reporting for Slate in August of 2020, says Grossman, quote, musters scientific research, anecdotal evidence, and a boatload of presuppositions to prepare his students for the realities of combat, while valorizing the notion that the thin blue line is humanity's last bulwark against total societal collapse. Peters took Grossman's online course in 2020 when the pandemic prevented in-person training. He said he came away with a much better sense of how and why so many American police officers seem to believe that the streets of America are effectively a war zone, and why the average American police department seems so resistant to reform. Grossman categorizes cops as basically like the Avengers, but with more body armor and less public accountability. His America is a terrifying place where police are both the primary targets of and defenders against superpredation. Quote, what does a predator do? They kill. Only a killer can hunt a killer. This is what Grossman said at one seminar that was filmed by The New Yorker. Grossman maintains that America is scarier than ever, and that cops may well be the ones with the most to fear. Quote, we know that if it were not for all the body armor, bulletproof vests worn by officers, law enforcement fatalities in the United States could easily be double or even triple what they are today, Grossman asserts. Continuing on, if this is not a war, then tell me what is. To be prepared for this war, Grossman trains cops to develop autopilot responses so that they will not be caught flat-footed when confronted by an armed suspect. Quote, is it possible to see a gun pointed at you, draw your own weapon, and shoot without conscious thought? Not only is it possible, in this case, it is highly desirable. Of course, his training must be state-of-the-art, so that he knows instantly that a threat is indeed a gun and not a wallet or a cell phone. As a cop or a peacekeeper, your job is not to kill. It is to serve and protect. To do that, though, you may have to kill. Your job is to stop the deadly threat, and the most effective way to do that is to make that threat die. This is a running theme in his course. He is very, very clear that police officers must be ready to manifest the will to kill and to deal with the aftermath of having done so. At no time does this training address the social construction of crime and criminality, or the historically racist coding of tough-on-crime policies and rhetoric, nor the political origins of this country's endless war on drugs, or any other factor that might complicate his thesis. He sees no oppression in the sight of a warrior cop forever riding roughshod through bad neighborhoods like members of an occupying army. He doesn't stop to consider that treating the war on crime like an actual war tacitly encourages cops to take less care with the lives of their enemies, nor does he acknowledge that those disposable lives are all too often black ones. On May 25th of 2020, in broad daylight, on a Minneapolis street, a police officer pressed George Floyd's neck under his knee for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, looking directly into cell phones for much of that time. That officer was the perfect embodiment of Grossman's training. In recent years, this style of training has seen a backlash from municipalities that now find them troubling. However, there's also been a counter backlash from police officers who seemingly can't get enough of the will to kill. When Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey banned warrior cop style courses in 2019, the local police union offered to pay for any cop who wanted to take the course. Peters says that On Combat teaches its students to fear and resent the people they serve, to willfully mistake this contempt for bravery, and to believe that heroism is conferred by the barrel of a smoking gun. This philosophy, as manifested by the countless police officers and officials who subscribe to it, is and will continue to be one of the foremost impediments to meaningful efforts at police reform in towns across America. Policing reform. The morale of law enforcement all over the country suffered after George Floyd's death and the subsequent civil unrest. Many cops left their jobs. There were calls to defund the police by activists. The massive protest movements ushered in an unprecedented wave of reform efforts that dominated local, state, and federal legislative agendas. Police and politicians across the country began scrutinizing the failures in police leadership, culture, and training. Police leaders in major cities are incorporating lessons learned from the Floyd case into their use of force policy. These reforms include the obligation of fellow officers to intervene in excessive force incidents, rendering first aid to those harmed by police, and holding police officers accountable by their colleagues for complaints and allegations of misconduct. But law enforcement leaders must face the long-term challenge of fostering a cultural change while building trust with communities. Many police agencies are creating community support units made up of social workers and mental health professionals. These units do a job that police should never have been asked to do in the first place. They intervene in situations where armed responses tend to escalate crises. These professionals are being consulted in the creation of de-escalation training as well, which is arguably one of the most valuable skills for street officers. Real change will require Americans to have searching and difficult conversations about policing. Unbiased policing has come to the forefront of the conversation, with an emphasis on use of force, de-escalation, implicit bias training, and racial profiling. According to the American Institute for Economic Research, only 28% of Black Americans believe the police treat all races equally, and only 40% have a favorable view of law enforcement officers at all. The cost of this discord between residents, particularly Black men, and police are feelings of alienation, oppression, and an unwillingness to report crime. If the goal is to create a safe and inclusive nation, all Americans must lean into our shared humanity. We need substantial non-enforcement interactions with law enforcement. We have to create platforms for meaningful engagement that reduce our shared biases. This means dialogue and forums, social opportunities, outreach, and conversations. The key is to not pull back, but to reach out. Real community police engagement works, and it is based on contact theory that has been shown to change minds and build empathy from issues of immigration to same-sex marriage. A National Academy of Science study found non-enforcement interactions created substantial improvement in perceptions of police performance and legitimacy, and fostered a willingness to cooperate with police. And Black respondents registered twice the improvement as white respondents. Money factors into necessary reforms as well. 62% of Americans favor community policing as an increased part of police budgets. While there has been substantial increases for 2021, only 4% of the law enforcement budget of the Department of Justice goes to community-oriented policing, and just 0.2% to developing community policing strategies. Even less goes to supporting non-enforcement interactions. These are changes that need to be made on the federal, state, and local levels. Community police engagement needs to be resourced at the same level, if not more, as other components of policing. And insurers are driving some of this change. Insurers are driving changes to police tactics and policies, mostly at small to medium-sized departments throughout the country. They're driving reforms that community activists, use of force victims, and city officials have been unable to achieve, according to reporting in the Washington Post. The changes come after increasingly large jury awards and settlements that cities and insurers must pay in police use of force cases, especially since the 2020 deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. These cases led, respectively, to settlements of $12 million and $27 million. Insurance companies pass the cost and potential future cost to their law enforcement clients. Larger departments, like those found in New York and Los Angeles, have special funds set aside that exclude them from external demands by insurers. But smaller departments don't have such cushions. According to insurance industry and police experts, some departments with a history of civil rights violations saw insurance rates shoot up 200 to 400% over the past 3 years. Departments with fewer previous issues have seen rates increase around 30 to 100%, as insurers tell departments they must change their mode of policing. One of the primary changes that insurance called for was fewer police pursuits. In one St. Louis department, retooling took effect in January of 2019, and the number of police pursuits has increased slightly. Still, pursuit crashes dropped from 25 in 2018 with 8 injuries to 10 in 2021 with 3 injuries, according to data provided by the department. The department also says that so far this year, there have been 3 crashes with no injuries. Instead, the department has adopted sticky darts equipped with GPS trackers as an alternative. While officers made dozens of arrests using GPS technology, overall arrests in the city have fallen more than 30% since the change. The city's police chief, Aaron Jimenez, blames officers' inability to chase motorists for the decline in arrest. But the issues have also hit taxpayers hard. Across the country, allegations over police conduct are at the taxpayers' expense. The Post investigation in March documented more than $3.2 billion spent over the past decade to resolve nearly 40,000 claims at 25 of the nation's largest police and sheriff departments. I've been doing this for 40 years, and this represents a major shift, said John Chino, a broker who secures insurance for cities and counties in 6 states. Continuing on, he states, they are asking lots of very detailed questions. Do they use chokeholds? What does their de-escalation training look like? If they aren't doing something on this list, they're required to get it if they want coverage. Accountability. NBC News reported in January of this year on a case where manslaughter charges were filed against 3 police officers in suburban Philadelphia after investigators say the trio heard gunshots outside a high school football game and returned fire in the direction of a crowd. Errant police bullets fatally struck an 8-year-old girl and injured 3 others, according to charging documents. It became the first publicly known case in the country this year in which an officer was charged with either manslaughter or murder in connection with an on-duty shooting. In past years, such a shooting might have been brushed aside as a tragedy by prosecutors and grand juries who were inclined to take the word of officers. But that may be changing. Quote, "We are all paying more attention to the process, and prosecutors know that investigations must be done thoroughly and in a more balanced way," Cedric Alexander, a former president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement, said. Historically, charges against officers who use lethal force remain rare, and convictions for serious charges even more unusual. But police experts say there has been a noticeable nudge in the other way. With growing pressure on prosecutors to thoroughly investigate cases and guilty verdicts reached in recent trials against officers, charges and convictions for killing in the line of duty are no longer beyond belief. In 2021, 21 police officers in the United States were charged with murder or manslaughter resulting from an on-duty shooting, the highest in a single year, according to a database by Bowling Green State University. Criminal justice professor Philip Stinson started tracking such instances in 2005. His data focuses solely on police shooting deaths and relies initially on media reports. In the past 5 years, 16 officers were charged in 2020, 12 in 2019, 10 in 2018, and 7 in 2017. Despite the record number of police officers charged, Stinson said the increase doesn't reflect a statistically significant change because the sample size remains small. Each year, police kill roughly 1,000 people nationwide, according to Mapping Police Violence, an organization that collects police use of force data. Experts say that the apparent decrease in fatal police shootings in 2021 may be explained by policy changes instituted in some police agencies in the wake of social justice protests, or some officers may be more cautious or even fearful about the consequences of using deadly force. Quote, "I think we are seeing a shift. While this is not a sea change, the public is asking for more accountability," Alexander said. In closing, changes are happening. Police officers in many jurisdictions are receiving better, saner, and safer training, but the cop as a warrior training continues in others. Bias training and increasing professional standards are making a difference, where police administrations are amenable to them. Bad cops are being outed, disciplined, fired, charged, and convicted. Measures of accountability we haven't seen before in this country. Police departments are pledging new transparency and working to institute real community policing efforts. All these efforts are walking uphill against decades and even centuries of negatives. Over the course of this series, we've looked at American criminal justice system through 3 different lenses: bail reform, crime, prisons and recidivism, and in our final episode, policing and crime. From our earliest history, there has never been a time we couldn't justifiably say we have a long way to go. Certainly, it's obvious that the system itself is in need of repair in every aspect. Reforms that have happened over time, those currently in the pipeline, and those that will come going forward, lend some hope that America will reach a time when its justice system is more equitable, more just, and far less ugly. And that concludes our series on criminal justice in America. We know you liked what you heard because you stayed with us to the end, so please hit that like button for the algorithms. It really does help us out. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share us with your friends. And as always, keep your head up through the political storm.